Hello, hello, hello. Hey, students, my favorite students ever. What's going on? Hope you guys are doing great. Hope you're having a good Monday. Sorry the weekend's over. But yeah. You guys again gave me a ton of work to do on the topics that you need help with. So, let's go over those. I had to make a list, and you guys are doing great. That's a lot of stuff. Okay. Um, so I tried to add on more than 10 things because we keep getting so many. And yeah, hopefully I can keep this video to a decent length, okay? Let's start with Reese wanted to know about the Ninth Amendment. And we'll talk about a couple other things with that too. Let me see if I can find that real quick. Ninth Amendment. There it is. No, there it is. Okay. And so I'm going to share entire screen. Yeah. Okay, so we're looking at the Ninth Amendment now. This is one of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, and I actually have a video on just the Bill of Rights. I got to find that for you guys, but I'll try to send that out as an extra credit assignment. Anyways, so the Ninth Amendment states the enumeration in the Constitution, and that means basically the noting of specific things. So the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So what is this about? You guys probably remember to some extent the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, when they were writing our Constitution and arguing about whether or not to adopt that, had a big fight. And one side said we need to put specific rights into the Constitution that are protected. And then others like Madison, James Madison, said, no, you shouldn't do that, because if you do that, government is always hungry for more power, and over time, the government will take away all other rights that aren't specifically listed in the Constitution. So if you're going to list them, you're basically saying you can do anything to me but these few things. And so he thought that was a really bad idea. And then the other side wanted to put the specific rights in there because they thought otherwise the government would trample upon them. And so kind of one of the things they came to was, okay, we're going to go ahead and list some of the rights. So we do have a Bill of Rights that lists specific rights, but we're going to also add in the Ninth Amendment as kind of a catch-all for anything we didn't list. So I hope you guys realize that it's kind of implied that we have a lot of rights other than just the ones listed in the Bill of Rights, but those are like the most fundamental ones, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom to own firearms, things like that, that the founders thought were crucial to a free society. But there's tons of others, like right to privacy, right to not being harassed by the government and the cops and anybody else, and all these things that had happened under England. So the Ninth Amendment covers that. So it says again, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. In other words, they're saying there are a lot more rights than just those listed in the Bill of Rights. And so you can still protect those as well. And that's why it was put in there, was to satisfy the people that thought we shouldn't have a Bill of Rights, because then the government will basically take the power to do whatever it wants to you other than those specific rights listed. Does that make sense, I hope? Anyways, let me know if you have any questions on that, okay? Let me see the next one here. We had a student that wanted to know more about Vernon J. Baker. He's a World War II hero, an African American. I think he was a second lieutenant. And really fun story and really interesting guy. You're not going to come across this character in most of your classes, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I thought he was definitely worth including a link to a video here, so go check that out if you like. Get a little more World War II history and some kind of civil rights history there. So that's a great story. So that was Vernon Baker. Um, and then orbital diagram practice. So I had some science students wanting help with that. Let's take a look at that. Where is my orbital diagram? Here we go. Okay, you guys can find this just about anywhere. If you just Google it, you'll find it. But how do orbital, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. How do orbital diagrams work when you are assigning electrons to different energy levels in atoms, okay? And so I assume you know about valence electrons, which are the ones that are in the outer level of most atoms, and they are available to either give away in an ionic bond or share with another atom in a covalent bond, and that's what makes compounds form, okay, valence electrons. But it's even more complicated than that, and I'm not going to get into all the details on this because that would take all day, but we can look at how these are assigned, okay? So this explains it pretty well. Orbital diagrams help visualize which orbitals the electrons in an atom are. There are different types of orbitals that have different energy levels. These orbitals are filled with electrons. The amount of electrons depends on which element you're looking at. So some elements don't have many electrons, and especially valence electrons, so they're going to be different than other atoms with more electrons, for instance. Okay, so if you use a periodic table, you can go from left to right, and you know they go up in valence electrons, and as you go down it, they generally go up in total amount of electrons. And so you can diagram out any element, and this is how you do it. So the s orbitals make up one box, and they contain 2 electrons. So any atom with 1 or 2 electrons will never get past the 1s level. Okay, I hope that makes sense. P orbitals make up 3 boxes, contain a max of 6 electrons, 2 in each box. D orbitals 5 boxes, 10 electrons. F orbitals 7 boxes, 14 electrons. Yada yada yada. I'm not going to read this all to you, but here's a cheat sheet for you and the written order. If you take chemistry, you will need to use this on a test at some point. But if an atom had, say, 1 electron, it would have 1 electron, valence electron, in the 1s level. If it had 6, it would have 2 in the 1s, 2 in the 2s, 2 in the 2p, for instance. So you just follow this order and assign the electrons and see where you end up, basically, okay? And this is how these orbital diagrams work. You can draw these or write them out. So they did a sodium atom here. It has 11 electrons, so you're going to have 2 in the 1s, 2 in the 2s, 6 in the 2p, and 1 in the 3s. So it has 1 valence electron in the 3s here, and the rest of these orbitals are filled, and that's how sodium would turn out there. And again, you can draw these with any atom, but that's basically all you're doing, okay? So that's orbital diagrams and how those work. You can pull them up and look at examples if you like online, okay? Moving on, we have the American Revolution timeline and Washington. Okay, so a lot of people asking about the American Revolution, which I think is awesome. That's kind of my jam. I love talking about this stuff, and I hope I don't go too crazy here. But I wanted to show you a couple of neat resources, and I've included links here. So here is one from Mount Vernon, which is the estate of George Washington that you can go visit. And they have a timeline here of things that happened with George Washington during the Revolution. And so he was appointed the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army in 1775, and then he takes command, and then they get beat up in this battle, and then they do the Declaration of Independence, and then he gets beat up in another battle, beat up in another battle, beat up in another battle, and finally, Christmas, the Battle of Trenton, things start turning. They sneak up and they do a sneak attack on Christmas morning, and it's the first big victory for the Patriots or the American Revolutionaries. And again, it bolstered the sagging morale of the Continental Army because they weren't doing too well. And famous picture of George Washington crossing, I think it's the Delaware River on Christmas Day. So pretty cool. Again, this guy has the stories in his life. He did a sneak attack at Princeton and then snuck off, and it really neat stuff going on here. And anyways, I'm not going to go over all of this, but it is really a really cool resource, and I'll include that, okay? And then another resource, let me close this one, just on the American Revolution in general, is Britannica here, who usually does really good work, okay? So 1763, the French and Indian War, and you guys probably understand already that the reason the American Revolution happens is during the French and Indian War, the British are fighting the French. There's Indian tribes on both sides. It's a very expensive war. The British win, and then they expect the colonies to help pay off the debt from the war. And the colonies are like, whoa, 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 we don't get to vote on any representatives in Parliament like the rest of England, so we don't feel like we should be having to pay for this. And England says, well, you're virtually represented by the English government because we have your best interest in mind at all times. And they didn't go for that. And anyways, England keeps trying to get them to pay for the damages and the expenses from the war. And excuse me, they keep passing new taxes. The colonists don't want to pay it, so England starts clamping down and making more laws and stopping them from making their own laws. They put troops in homes. They tax their tea. They tax everything, sugar, you name it. They taxed it. And the next thing you know, the colonists have had enough, and they declare independence. And they form their own Congress. And it's fascinating, all the events that take place at that point. But here is a nice timeline of these things, and you can look at that on Britannica. There's some nice pictures there and other resources as well. But yeah, so there's the American Revolution. I don't know if you guys had specific questions on that. We could talk about it for like a week probably to cover all the details, so I'm not going to even attempt that, but here's a timeline so to kind of give you the big picture of what's going on. A really great series on TV about this would be John Adams, the John Adams series. I think it was written by HBO, and I'm not gonna lie, like, you might want to check with your parents. There's some stuff in there that a lot of parents wouldn't want their kids watching. There's a lot of violence. There's some nudity, things like that. It's definitely rated R. And there's a few scenes in there I wish they would have left out. But overall, it is an amazing series on our founders and on the American Revolution and the big events that happened. So I would highly recommend it. But check with your parents first, because there's some naughty stuff in there. As I'm a dad myself, and that's what the term I would use. And there's definitely a lot of violence in there, which was real, you know. So check with your parents before you watch that. But the John Adams series is amazing. You will remember events in that because it is so well done. And they will stick in your brain forever. So really good stuff, okay? Let's move on. So there's a lot of American Revolution stuff, and I'll send you the links. The Lewis and Clark expedition, I actually found the journal entries, okay, which are awesome because it's those guys in their own words. And I don't know if I kept those open. It doesn't look like it, but I'll send you the link. Anyway, so why did the Lewis and Clark expedition happen? Well, the United States bought basically half of our nation in the Louisiana Purchase from France, because France again was at war and they needed resources and money, and sold us a ton of land, like basically from almost Missouri all the way up to Washington. The whole western part of the nation we bought from them in that deal, and we didn't know what was in there. So Thomas Jefferson, while he was president, commissioned Lewis and Clark to go and explore, and he wanted to know about resources, Indian tribes, rivers, lakes, what's out there. We don't know. And so that's what they did. And they came across new animals, new territories, new Indian tribes, new dangers. It's a pretty amazing expedition they had. And they come back and tell all about it. And So this link I'm including here will have their journal entries. You can actually read what they saw in their own words. It's fascinating. And it's a good example of primary resources as well, okay? And then a lot of people are asking about the fur trade. I know you students that have classes in Washington, the Washington State History, I don't think that's the name of the class, but that's basically what it is. You guys need a ton of this information. So I got a page specifically on the fur trade in the Northwest. I'm by no means any expert on that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I wanted to have something for you. So again, I'll send you the link, but there's a Center for the Study of the Pacific Northwest, and they had a nice long article on the fur trade and some of the famous people involved with that. So that might be good to help you guys on some of your assignments if you're in that Washington State history class, okay? And so there's some good information here. There's a ton of information on the fur trade all over the internet if you need more, but here's some specific to the Washington or the Pacific Northwest, okay? Moving on, again, Nisqually tribe history. I'm going to include a link because 90% of my students will never need to know anything about that for their courses, but it is fascinating. So I included a link here, especially so anybody interested, you can go look at it, and especially those students again in Washington taking those courses, you'll need this information most likely. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, but there is that. And then I have a polymers video because somebody wanted information on that. And I know that does come up in our either physical science or chemistry courses a lot. So there's a short video. It's actually really entertaining. It's pretty funny. And it's good stuff. So I'll send you the link on that. You can learn all about polymers, which I don't think I need to read that to you, but yeah, there's some great information in there. Okay, and then the next one we had was history of slavery in the American colonies. I don't remember which student it was, but they wanted to know more about slavery. And again, we can talk about this all day, guys, and I'm not going to do that, but I did find some really interesting resources here, okay? So here's an article, and I'll send you this link. Did America create slavery? We actually had a senator a couple years ago say the United States created it, which is a pretty ignorant statement if you know any world history at all. Slavery's been around as long as people have been around, and so that's sad, but that's the truth. Yeah, I just wanted to show you a couple neat things in this article, and it's got footnotes of all the sources because some of this stuff I found hard to believe at first, but then you go look it up and it looks like, yeah, it's good information. It says, for example, in ancient Greece, which existed thousands of years before America, nearly 30% of the entire population in Greece were slaves. In the Roman Empire, almost 40% of the population were slaves. So these ancient civilizations were really good at slavery, and that was a big part of their world. Prior to the transatlantic slave trade by the Spanish from Africa to South America in the early 1500s, Africa had already participated in a robust trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean slave trade. The black tribes of Africa would raid, capture, and enslave other black tribes for profit, selling them across the continent and beyond. So most of the people capturing the slaves were other tribes in Africa, actually. I don't know, maybe a lot of people don't understand that. Many of the slaves were sold into the Islamic Middle East. A lot of the slave traders that went through Africa at that time were Muslim traders and explorers. Most likely it says it was this racial bias which was translated to the Iberian Peninsula. So medieval Arabs came to associate the most degrading forms of labor with black slaves. In other words, they didn't treat them very well when the Muslims conquered parts of the area in the 8th century. And so there's a little bit of the history of the slave trade in Africa in here, which is fascinating. This is pretty interesting. What is perhaps even more astounding is that a larger number of white Europeans were captured and sold into African slavery than the number of Africans sold into the land that would become the United States. Just over 300,000, they say, black slaves or slaves from Africa landed in the North American colonies, which became America, but 1.25 million white Europeans were captured and shipped to slave markets in northern Africa. This Barbary Coast trade lasted longer than American slavery and was only stopped through the naval efforts of the British and the Americans. You'll learn about the Barbary conflict when Thomas Jefferson was president. He basically sent in the Marines to go attack them, and we were already having trouble with them raiding our boats and kidnapping people even back in the late 1700s. Furthermore, it was not until the late 17th century that black slaves in the New World outnumbered white slaves in the Old. So, a lot of people think it's just Africans being put into slavery, and I mean, there was a lot of them, and it was horrible. And in South America, they made up a huge percentage of the slave population. But in other parts of the world, there was a lot of other groups of people that were also forced into slavery and taken advantage of that way. So really interesting article here. They have a lot of other resources on this site. I found this to be a really good site in the past, and the people that put this information up are actually really responsive if you ever want to discuss it with them or get more information or learn more about their sources. So it's pretty cool. And then this is another interesting resource. Again, I'll send these all to you. 1655, one of the first court rulings on slavery in the American colonies, which led to slavery being lifelong for African slaves. This is fascinating because it was actually an African American, a black man living in the colonies that owned black slaves, and he went to court to try to keep his slave when he had escaped. And this is not, the majority of slave owners at that time, but there were quite a few actually African men that owned slaves, African slaves at the time, and even some white slaves at the time. So it's a little more complicated than we usually think about on the surface. But a summary of this is on March 8th, 1655, the Northampton County Court ruled in favor of Anthony Johnson, a free man of African descent, when he was accused of keeping an indentured servant as a slave. And so this is the first court case that I've ever seen in the American colonies about slavery. And I think it's either this case or another one after it with the same kind of situation leads to the idea that most of these African slaves would be slaves for life instead of like a European slave that was usually in for a certain amount of years, like 12 years, and then they'd work off their debt for being brought over to the New World. But yeah, all that happened through court cases, and this was one of the first ones. So just fascinating stuff. And again, I'll include this link if you want to go research this further. A lot of stuff you don't hear about in books and in movies and things like that that was actually real. And an example is an African man owning African slaves, and it was the first court case regarding that. Excuse me. I've always tried to explain, and I do this in my video, one of the videos I send you for extra credit, that our founding fathers were a lot more complicated on this issue than they're given credit for. Many of them were abolitionists. John Adams, Samuel Adams, Benjamin Franklin were all abolitionists. They detested slavery and wanted to make it completely illegal and stopped at all times. George Washington owned a ton of slaves at one time, and as he got later in life, he started writing that he felt guilty about owning slaves, and he thought it was wrong that he was claiming to be a Christian man and owned slaves, and he wanted to get rid of slavery. And he actually, in his will, he leaves it in there that when he and his wife pass, the slaves are all freed on his plantation, but they would also be given an allowance from the income of the plantation for the rest of their lives. His goal for that was they could all go to school and become educated to find better lives for themselves. Um, Thomas Jefferson owned a lot of slaves and he gets bashed a lot. At the same time, he tried to illegalize the slave trade in Virginia and wanted to get rid of slavery in Virginia, but the King of England would not allow him to do that when he was the governor. So again, it's complicated. He had slaves, but he was trying to free them at the same time as well. And then a lot of our founding fathers were actually abolitionists working against slavery. And then some of them owned slaves and didn't want to do anything about it, of course. You have all of the above within that group of about 50 or 60 famous statesmen at the time, okay? So just know that you can't just say all of them were horrible, evil, racist men, because that's not true at all. Some of them were, yes, okay? Let's see, what else? On top of that, the 3/5 compromise, I'll send out an extra credit video on that at some point. Most people don't understand that that's an anti-slavery document. It was put into place to limit how much of the population of the South, which has a huge slave population, would be counted as population towards Southern states getting representatives in the House of Representatives. So the more representatives you have, the more votes you have in the House, the more power you have to make laws. So a lot of people don't seem to understand that by limiting the power of the South, you're limiting the power of slave owners because they're not letting slaves serve in government or even vote. It's all the slave owners with all the power. So the 3/5 compromise says that you could only count 3/5 of all the slaves in slave states towards population, which is way better than 5/5 of the slave population. They would have had a lot more power in the House of Representatives. So what you're doing is you're limiting how many representatives slave states get in Congress. And then later on, George Washington signs into law the Northwest Ordinance, which says any new states coming in cannot have slavery. So you're setting them up to take over the Senate with anti-slavery people. So I think the founders, and it's not a secret, a lot of them wanted to, over time, allow our government to get rid of slavery. They called it a deferred promise. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson writes about all men created equal and should be treated equally under the law. A lot of our founders actually believed that. They just couldn't do that at the time of the American Revolution because if they freed all the slaves, the southern states would break away, and then the northern states would have had to fight England all by themselves, and that probably would not end well. So they had to accept slavery temporarily, but they were setting it up so that Congress eventually could get rid of slavery with the 3/5 compromise and the Northwest Ordinance. Over time, anti-slave states would control the House and the Senate. If you think about it, it's a very clever way to try to not destroy the country, but to, yes, get rid of slavery at some point. Of course, it comes up in another way with the Civil War, but those documents were anti-slave documents that our founders put forth. And so I think we should be proud of them in that aspect of their history, okay? Let's move on. World Slave History Facts. Yeah, I gave you some of those already. A couple students are asking about time management, which is always a challenge. I just wanted to show you this book. I got to meet the author when I was a coach. I was coaching college football for a while, and this guy came and did a presentation for our students on basically life hacks to get their homework done. And it was really good. And this book is really good. You can order it on Amazon. You can get a 99-cent audio book, or you can buy it for 12, 15 bucks, whatever. But David Horsager is the author, and this is really good. And I'll just give you a couple tidbits. One thing he says is before you go to bed at night, make a list on a sticky note or on a piece of paper or something of the main things you have to get done the next day. So you make a list. So you're not just reacting all day, but you have a plan of what you got to get done the next day so you can check those things off. there's a much higher chance you'll get them done if you have them listed and you have to scratch them off when you get them done. And so just something as simple as that. The other thing he recommends a lot is scheduling. And you can use like Google Calendar, or there's a lot of other apps, and you can go in and actually schedule out your day by hour. Some of the football players would do 15-minute increments of their day. They would get that in detail of what they're going to be doing with their day to make sure they don't waste it. But you want to get a routine and a schedule and stick to it. You want to do your homework at the same time and same place whenever you can. You want to, any other tasks you have to do, try to do them at the same time every day, because that routine is very strong in you getting it done. It creates habits, and habits are hard to break. So you want to create good habits. If you create the habit of not setting goals, not scheduling, not planning out your next day, then you're going to get a lot less done in general. So you want to try to do those three things. And again, it becomes a habit, either good or bad, whichever way you're doing it, it's going to become a habit. So try to schedule out your day before you go to bed the next day, and try to get in a routine where you do things at the same time and same place when you can. And those are huge in just winning every single day and getting things done. Okay. So a great book if you want to read it. It's really short. I think it's about 50, 60 pages, but it was awesome. I got a lot out of that book, and the players that we worked with said they really enjoyed it too. So yeah, just another tidbit on your classes on Imagine Learning. Take notes on the instructions. Take notes, lots and lots of notes. Study those when you can. If you're sitting in a car, study them. If you're driving somewhere or you're riding in a car, study them. If you're just sitting around with 5 minutes before class starts, study your notes, study your notes, study your notes. Okay. And then you have to really focus on assessments. Our quizzes, tests, and exams are worth a lot more points than your assignments. So if you ace those, it'll really do a lot to making your grade better. Okay. And then we had a couple students asking about FDR's 4 terms as president. How is that possible? Which is a great question. And I'm going to send you a resource on that on History Channel. It's pretty cool. He was the first and only president to serve 4 terms. Before the 22nd Amendment, there were no term limits on president. Our founders actually thought if there was a president we really liked, we should be able to keep re-electing them. FDR, it was right in the middle of World War II, and the Great Depression was just starting to end, and he got reelected to his 4th term, but then he dies shortly thereafter. But he was really good at selling to the American public what he was doing. He was one of the best salesman presidents we've ever had. He would do fireside chats where he would get on the radio. This was before TV became big, and most people just had a radio. And a certain night of the week, at a certain time every week, he would give us a little conversation where he would talk to the American people and tell them what's going on, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. And he just demolished the people that ran against him for president because the people loved how well he communicated. To be honest, I don't think a lot of his policies really worked that well, but he sold them so well that they believed they were working. And there's an assignment a lot of you will get on the Great Depression, and we learned that the country really starts recovering from the Great Depression when we finally start getting rid of the New Deal programs that FDR put into place. A lot of people believe that those programs fixed our economy. Actually, our economy was in really bad shape 11 years into those programs. The rest of the world had already pretty much recovered from the Great Depression, and the United States was behind everybody else, probably because of most of those programs. I'm not saying they didn't help some people, but in the overall health of the economy, they really hamstrung the economy. And so it's not till World War II breaks out that we start getting rid of a lot of those programs, and then the economy starts picking up again. Anyways, a lot of interesting history with FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and his 4 terms. the Republicans at the time were afraid he was going to become a dictator because he was so popular and he had served so long, and so many in the government were basically beholden to him because he had, you know, gained so much power over his time. And so they thought they had to pass a law. And a lot of Democrats actually agreed with it, which was his party, that you need a law limiting terms on president because they can become too powerful. And they didn't want it to turn into a dictatorship or anything like that. So that's basically what happened. But here's a nice article. There's a video here as well. And you can learn more about FDR serving 4 terms as president. Pretty interesting stuff. Again, because we passed the 22nd Amendment, now you can't serve more than 2 terms, which was the precedent set by George Washington. Okay, and then the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. And this is some crazy stuff. And I found there's a ton of excellent sites and videos on YouTube about this and the French Revolution in general. And let me see if I still have this up. Yeah, why the French Revolution was worse than you thought. This is an excellent video, and it shows really neat movie clips from an actual movie about it. So that was pretty cool. But basically, the French Revolution is an example of big government getting everything it wants. And honestly, Karl Marx was not around yet. He wasn't famous yet. He hadn't written most of his famous documents yet. But these guys were basically Marxists, the ones that are pushing the French Revolution, and they take control immediately thereafter and start chopping everybody's heads off. They believe government should save you, that religion is terrible, and everybody should be an atheist, and they go after the churches, and they chop off a lot of church people's heads and believers' heads. And they basically set up a government that has no accountability. And they basically say, we're going to do what's best for the liberty of the country, which means we can do anything we want, and there's nothing anybody can do. There's nobody to stop the government from going crazy. And it does. It goes crazy, and a lot of people die. You see the same thing in Stalinist Soviet Union. They basically kill everybody that opposes them. This is a common theme of socialists and Marxists when the government becomes too powerful. You no longer have elections. You no longer have free speech. You no longer have freedom of religion. Nothing. And it's all in the interest of making everybody equal, supposedly, even though those promises are never accomplished in socialist regimes. But this is like a pre-socialist, socialist regime, and you can see how it all plays out and how France just goes nuts during this whole thing. And the violence is just sickening. And this video does a great job. It's not real gross or anything, but it explains a lot of what went on in a nice little timeline format. So you guys can check that out. Okay, the Reign of Terror, which again then leads to Napoleon taking over because people are so sick of their government. They want somebody to come in and do something, so they turn to a tyrannical dictator to replace the last group of tyrannical dictators. But that's how history goes sometimes. So there it is. There's the Reign of Terror. I'm going to send this email, and I will send out all these topics to you guys. Let me stop sharing here. Okay. So yeah, that's all I got. Let me know if you guys have any questions. We're starting to get kind of close to the end for a lot of you. A lot of your classes end in about a month and a week in December. So just start worrying about your grade. If you haven't been taking notes, start taking notes. Start studying more. You know, do what you need to do to finish strong and get the credits, okay? But let me know if you guys need any help, have any questions, or you want to know more about any of these topics. We'll do this again in a week, okay? Hey, guys, take care. Have a great day.